We were in the middle of learning the laws of shofar, right? And so the notes would be Yamim Norah in part 3. That's where we're going to start in the middle. And if I'm not mistaken, we just did in my notes Roman numeral 7. We talked about eating. I think the last thing we talked about was making kiddush before blowing the shofar, whether you're allowed to eat before shofar. I think so. The next thing we're about to study is Roman numeral 8, Rosh Hashanah, that falls out on Shabbos, which is not the case this year, unfortunately, for those of us that have to work out issues with their jobs, because it blows away the whole week. But that's the way it is this year. But I will discuss a little bit the laws of Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos regarding blowing shofar. This is some historical interest here. So in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, right, the shofar was blown in Jerusalem, but at some point there was a takana, gzera made not to blow shofar outside when you're not near the presence of the Beis Din Hagadol, of the Great Sanhedrin that was based in Jerusalem. So the concern was that a person might not know very well how to blow the shofar, and comes Rosh Hashanah morning, he starts freaking out and being nervous because everyone depends on him to blow the shofar. So he might grab his shofar and run to a neighbor who's an expert in order for him to teach him something and to teach him how to do it. So, and in such a case, he may violate the laws against carrying on Shabbos or on Shabbat. So, however, because in Jerusalem, because people were in the presence of the Great Sanhedrin, they weren't worried that this is going to happen. So, because people were in the presence of the Great Sanhedrin, the fear of the Sanhedrin, well, fear is not the right word, the awe and respect. So it's less likely that people would forget that it's Shabbos and carry on Shabbos. So that was the origin then. Now, nowadays, there is no more Beis Din Hagadol. There is no more Great Sanhedrin. So therefore, anywhere, even in Jerusalem, the custom is not to blow the shofar on Shabbos for that reason. Now, there is one opinion among the Richonim, and it's a famous one, and that is the opinion of the Rif, Yitzchak Alfasi, who was one of the early Rishonim, I think somewhere around the 11th century or so. And he felt that Beis Din Hagadol doesn't mean the Sanhedrin, but it meant a big Beis Din, like a big rabbinical court. So therefore, he said that in the presence of any large rabbinical, respectable rabbinical court, one is supposed to blow the shofar. Now, exactly how you define what's considered a large, respectable rabbinical court is left. It leaves a lot of openings. But you can imagine, some people think that this is considered large and respectable, and other people don't. Well, he happens to be just a single opinion, and almost every other authority disagrees and feels that when the Gemara says the Beis Din Hagadol, it's referring specifically to the Sanhedrin. But according to the Rif, should we determine nowadays that there is a Beis Din Hagadol, a great Beis Din that everyone, I mean, again, the definition is really up for grabs here. What a great Beis Din that presumably everybody respects and so on, then you would blow shofar in their presence even nowadays on Shabbos. When the Chief Rabbinate was reestablished during the early days of the State of Israel, there were those religious Zionist rabbinic leadership that they had high hopes for the Chief Rabbinate. Nowadays, it's kind of so political that those high hopes have been unfortunately not realized. But the high hopes were that this was going to be the great Beis Din that everyone subscribes to and everyone looks up to and so on. So there was a movement among some of the religious Zionist rabbis to say that today we now have a Beis Din Hagadol in Jerusalem, and therefore we should reinstitute in Jerusalem blowing shofar on Shabbos. So some places kind of started sort of doing it, but it never took. So nowadays, for the most part, as far as I know, no one blows shofar even in Jerusalem on Shabbos if Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos. If anyone is aware of a place that does, then let me know. But as far as I know, that custom didn't take. So that's basically what we need to know about the laws of shofar on Shabbos, on Shabbat. So we wouldn't blow the shofar for the reasons stated, even in Jerusalem. So now the next thing is to discuss the sounds and exactly how long they need to be, what they need to sound like, how they are stated, and then we're going to study after that the shofar itself, what kind of animal it should come from, what the horn has to look like, and so on. So we're going to that's what we're going to about to do now. So the first thing is remember, we already explained where the origin of the number of sounds come from. We explained where teruah comes from. Your Rosh Hashanah is called the Yom Teruah, and teruah we explained is a broken sound. And we also explained that where the rabbis derived from the verses that each teruah needs to be preceded and succeeded by a tekiah, by a solid straight sound. So that we studied already last time. But now we're going to go into a little bit about the laws of how long. So the tekiah, because it's before and after, it also has to be approximately the same length of the sounds in the middle. So the sounds in the middle are going to be either a teruah, which is going to be a minimum, we'll see this in a minute, of 9 consecutive short bursts. So whatever that amount of time is, right? And by the way, whether it's 9 or not is a machloket. If you see in 9b, whether a teruah is actually 3 or 9. The custom among everyone, pretty much, both Sephardim and Ashkenazim, is to go like the Smag, who held that at 9. But if you only did 3 kosher quick blows, then you could probably depend on Rashi's opinion if you lost the shofar or something and you can't go back. But the general opinion among all Jews is to do 9. So if you're doing it through in the middle, the length of those 9, each tekiah before and after should be the same length, or possibly even a little longer, because the sound needs to be surrounded one by the other. We compare like any other hekesh in the Torah, sound A to sound B, so it has to be approximately the same length. So in that case, the tekiah that precedes a shvarim teruah, right, which is twice as long, right, because a teruah is going to be 9 short blasts, and a shvarim is going to be 3 slightly longer blasts, which is about the same length as the 9 short blasts. So when you do a shvarim teruah, it's twice as long, right? Instead of 9 sounds, it's 18. Well, I wrote 18, but it's actually 9 plus 3, but those 3 are equal to 9, whatever. Anyway, so exactly what the time is very is subject to a lot of opinions. So depending on how long a teruah is supposed to be, and it really depends on the blower himself. So the actuality is that people somewhat make a mistake and think that the halacha is that the teruah has to be a certain length. That's not actually true. A teruah is the length of the person who does it. So if the person can do it in 0.2 seconds, then that's the length each burst. So then 0.2 times 9, that's 1.8 seconds would be the total, right? But there's various calculations, and they range among the poskim between a total of 2.5 and 5 seconds. And then you divide 2.5 by 9, and you know how long of each burst of the teruah is. So because of these differences, there's a lot of differences in exactly how long it's supposed to be. But if you do if you do it, at 2.5 seconds in length for each whole sound, then you would have fulfilled pretty much all of the opinions. Now, if a person does a teruah, we're used to hearing which it's the same note. But if a person does it, like, in other words, he does different musical notes, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And I mean, every year you read about people who are skilled in blowing the shofar and almost playing a tune with it, which would be kosher if you could do it. It would be quite a challenge to make a tune that actually sounds reasonably nice. But if you can do it, then fine. So there's no issue in changing the note of the blow as long as it's the right length and the right form of of the sounds. So okay, so we talked about the teruah. We talked about the fact that there's difference of opinion whether it's 3 short bursts, a minimum of 3 versus a minimum of 9. If you do more, right, then most folks can say you're yotze. It's okay. So if you do 10 or 11 and you don't do exactly 9, that's fine as long as you did 9. And the same thing goes for a shvarim. Shvarim has to be 3 slightly longer bursts. And those would end up adding up to each one of the shvarim would add up approximately to 3 terumitin, which 3 short bursts, 3 truas, three trua sounds. So the question then is, so if a shvarim is actually how long the shvarim has to be, how long each one. Most folks can say it should be the length of 3 trua sounds. Some say it could be even the length of 2 trua sounds. So a shvarim would be significantly shorter. And also, there's 2 customs that these are actually customs. Some communities have the custom to specifically blow the shvarim so that it changes notes in the middle. This is among Ashkenazi communities, you find this different. I think, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, that certain Lithuanian communities specifically do the shvarim not but rather because it sounds more of a cry when it's done that way. So they deliberately change the note in the middle, as long as they don't go which is 2 sounds, right? But as long as they're going so then it's fine. So that would be the shvarim sound. So so basically we've discussed the shvarim sound, different customs on how to do the shvarim sound. We could discuss changing notes. We discussed the length of them all, and we talked about the trua sound, how long each burst has to be, how many bursts you need to make, whether it's 3 versus 9, and then that the tekiah has to be at least the length of the notes that it's surrounding. Okay, everybody got all that? It's a little confusing, but those are the rules. So now there's a couple other rules that we have to go through when it comes to how these sounds are made. So first of all, the general order is tekiah shvarim, tekiah first, then tekiah trua, tekiah second, and then tekiah shvarim trua, tekiah third. That's the general order, the way we do it, but it's not na'akiv. In other words, there's no law that states that it has to be that way. That's the custom. That's the custom that we do. But you can, if you did it the other way around, or you mix them all up, you're still yotze the mitzvah. There's another question about, in general, the law is that you have to have and the Gemara talks about this and why, but when you blow a tekiah, trua, and then a tekiah, or any one of those notes, between the tekiah and the trua, you have to, there has to be a breath, right? So you go, and you take a short breath, and then take a short breath, and there's, in other words, because it has to be broken up. It's not supposed to be the same one. But let's say you can hold a lot of air and you have a big set of lungs, and you go, without taking a breath, but you stop. So some say that since you stop, that's considered a separate call, and some say that stopping is not enough. You actually have to break it up. Otherwise, if you didn't take a breath, it's still considered one long call, and then that wouldn't have been a sound that you're supposed to make, and you wouldn't be yotze. So if you want to be yotze according to every opinion, then you should actually take a small breath in between. Then the other question is, what about shvarim teruah? So we said, we know that, which is kind of like one sound, but it's kind of like 2 sounds, right? It's the shvarim teruah we do because, remember we said that some say that the entire sound of the teruah includes both the shvarim and the teruah. So there's some say that you have to take a breath in between, because they're 2 separate sounds, the shvarim and the teruah. Some say that you could take a breath in between, and then there are actually opinions that say that you're not allowed to take a breath in between because they're 1 sound, and if you take a breath in between, you just made 2 sounds. So however, even those that hold that you should take a breath in between agree that if you don't, it's okay. So therefore, the general custom became, in order to fulfill all of the opinions, because there was 3 separate opinions on this debate, in order to fulfill all of them, the general custom is not to take a breath, right? Because if you go without a breath in between, then everyone agrees that it's okay. Even those that say that you should say that it's still okay if you don't. So therefore, that's the general custom. Both Sephardim and Ashkenazim do that. Now, what if you're the rabbi and the guy who's blowing the shofar, the Baal Tukea, does a shvarim trua and does take a breath? So you don't really have to ask him to go over, because most opinions say that that's okay. Some people even say that's what you're supposed to do. So you don't have to bring everyone back to shul and have them blow shofar again. But if you want to do it the right way, and so that all opinions are yotze, and do it the way the custom became, is when you do the shvarim trua, don't breathe in between. Okay, so then there's the issue of when do you have to go back, right? So if, let's say, if he can't get out 9 truas, right? The Baal Tukea blowing the shofar, does only 6. He just, whatever, he loses his breath or whatever reason, he just can't do it. Or he does the shvarim, without breaking in between, or he does only 2 instead of 3 or whatever. So if you there's times when you have to repeat the whole unit, meaning the kia trua tekia, right? Or when you just go back to the one that you're doing. And the general principle is as follows. If you do a kol, whether it's a tekia, a shvarim, a trua, or a shvarim trua, if you do that kol and for some reason it was halachically not a kosher kol, then the person, the Baal Makri, you typically the rabbi, but whoever it is will tell the person blowing the shofar, repeat that kol until you get a proper tekiah or a proper shvarim. He doesn't have to go over the whole set. So let's say it's a tekiah through a tekiah. He goes, and then he gets lost, right? So the rabbi will say, okay, do the trua again, right? Until he gets it out, and then we keep on going. He doesn't have to go back and do a tekiah again. However, let's say what he's supposed to do, he was supposed to do a tekiah, trua tekiah, but he made a mistake and he did the wrong kol. He did a tekiah shvarim tekiah instead. So then you have to go back and do the whole set again. So in those cases, let's say, the rabbi is following along and the Baal Tukea is blowing along. And then all of a sudden the rabbi realizes that instead of doing 3 tekiah trua tekiyahs and then 3 tekiah shvarim tekiyahs, he really did 2 tekiah trua tekiyahs and 4 tekiah shvarim tekiyahs. So then at the end of the whole thing, he has to go back and do another set because the whole set was no good. So that's the difference. So in other words, the bottom line is that if you make a mistake in a kol, then just repeat it. If the mistake is caught, then just repeat that kol, that sound. However, if you do the wrong kol, right? Then you have to go back and do the whole set again. All right. So any comments or questions about the sounds, about all the laws of the sounds? Because we went through, I think, everything. Go ahead. Pauline?
Does somebody teach you how to, do you have to learn how to blow the shofar? I mean, does somebody teach you how to do it? Like learning, it's like kind of like an instrument. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, you should. It's not that hard to get a sound out of a shofar, but someone should. Usually, people teach them. A lot of kids, like as a kid, I remember we used to always grab the shofar and try to play with it. And then eventually somebody shows you how to do it. But how to actually do it properly and get it, and get a good, nice, clear, loud sound that's kosher, it takes practice like anything else.
Right. You have somebody to guide you, to help you to.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the whole point. Remember, the rabbi said on Shabbos not to do it because you might run to an expert who's going to teach you. So that's what they're afraid of, that you might grab the shofar and run to an expert and then carry with no eruv.
Is this all set forth in the Talmud? What you've just
yes. Pretty much everything I said comes from the Talmud, except some of the things, the ones that have all the big debates about, are debated usually among the Richonim, among the the early halachic authorities. And some of it is custom, like we were talking about the sound of the shvarim, whether or not it's one note or it's like that. So that's a custom issue. That's not a halachic issue. Any other questions or comments on the sounds before we go on to I would be able to go through the derivation of each one of these laws from the pages in the Talmud, but we'd be here forever talking about one issue. So I'm trying to, but it's definitely something we can do. And if there's something that you want, a specific law I go over and you want to know who says which opinion and where it comes from, just text me offline and I'll give you the information. Any other comments about the sounds before I move on to the next subject, which is the laws of the shofar itself?
Yeah, the question is not about the sounds per se, but about is halachically it required that someone call out what the sounds are going to be before they're blown into the shofar?
That's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up. I think I'm going to mention it in my next set, but if I didn't, then I should have put it in. But it's a custom to do that, but it's not halachically required. And the reason for the custom is because it's hard for the Baal Tokea to do it, because it can get confusing. He can lose track. And also someone who can keep track of whether or not he's doing it halachically proper, whether he did 9 or 7, or did he do it too long, too short, etc. But it is a custom to have a Baal Makri, and in most communities that usually is the rabbi, but it doesn't have to be, someone else who's, knows the laws could do it. But that is the custom, but it's not a requirement. In fact, in the synagogues that have the custom to blow the shofar during the silent Amidah, when they blow during the silent Amidah, there is no Baal Makri, no one is calling it out. So there is a case where if he made a mistake and he has to do a whole set again, the rabbi has to keep track in his mind so that when Shmona Esrei is over, he has to tell the guy, okay, we got to go back and do a set again because you made a mistake, because it's an easy place to get messed up. Any other questions? So if there isn't, we'll go on. So the shofar, right, is a horn. It's an animal horn, right? But I'm not an expert on the biology of horns, but we can all imagine there's a lot of different types of horns, and try to imagine in your mind the typical horn of a goat or a sheep, right? So paint that image in your mind. Then imagine the horn of a cattle, right? The horn of a cow. And then imagine the horns like antlers of certain species of deer or things like that, or animals like that. So I'm not going to give you a lecture on the structural difference between those 3 types of horns, but the horn can come from either a behema or a chaya. Behema it's not a biological category. A behema means a domesticated animal, which typically means a goat, a cow, sheep. Those are behemos because they're domesticated. And even if there happens to be a sheep that's not living on a farm, that's roaming around the fields by himself or herself, it's still considered a behema. And a chaya, and these are halachic categories, not so don't try to fit them into your zoological knowledge, because it won't fit. A chaya means an animal that naturally lives in the wild, even if you happen to have one that's on a farm. So let's say you have a deer farm, which there are many of those these days, but a deer is still, since principally a deer, not a domesticated animal, it's therefore considered a chaya. Now, I'm saying all this because a shofar can come from either a behema or a chaya, but it has to be the type of horn which we find on a sheep or a goat, which is a type of horn that it's one piece, so which knocks out the antlers, right? And antlers are not kosher, right? And it has to be, you have to be able to hollow it out, right? And then it has to be not called, and halachically there's another category between a shofar and a keren. And there is a difference between exactly how they grow, how they form. Keren refers to a cow's horn, a cattle horn. And if you put in your mind the idea of a cow's horn, it's usually smooth, it's white, it's more like a bone, and it comes to a sharp tip typically. And it's different. I mean, you can think, and that's called a keren in Hebrew, and that's not a kosher shofar. But any other horn that is similar to what we think of goats and sheep, which are very, very closely related, is considered kosher. So it can't be an antler, and it can't be the type of horn that's a cow horn. Now, typically, these types of horn is bent. And there's a lot of symbolism in the bent shofar, because the bent means it represents how we bend ourselves in humility before God. Bending ourselves is the whole idea of the holiday, and the shofar represents that. So it's very important to seek out a bent shofar when that's a choice. Now, if you just happen to be, for some reason, I don't know, somewhere in the middle of Africa and you don't have a shofar, and the only one, and there's the animals that have this similar kind of horn, but they're straight. I forget the name of some of these animals. Maybe someone remembers.
The
But they're
ibex?
ibex. I think some of them have curved and some have straight. There's one that I'm thinking of.
It's almost like spiral.
Well, the spiral one is kosher. That's considered bent, right? But there are some that it grows. Wait, I'm thinking of one in particular, and you guys give me 1 second.
Sorry.
That has a straight horn, and it's called an oryx. So if you can look up anything, ORYX, right? So it also, look at an image, and I'm pretty sure that it's a straight horn. So technically speaking, this would be kosher, but not preferred, right? Because it's straight. Yeah, look at a picture of an oryx, and you'll see that it's straight. So and there's other animals like that technically are kosher because the horn is the right biologic type, but because they're straight, it's not preferred. So you should always seek after a curved horn, not a straight horn, for the reasons which we just said. Now, what if all you have is a straight horn, and if you heat it up over a fire, you can meld it and you can bend it? Well, that's fine, right? But you can't take it and change it into something else. Like if you turn it inside out by bending it, apparently that's possible to do. I don't know. Apparently when it gets soft and warm, you can meld, you can shape it, and you may even be able to turn it inside out, or then that would not be kosher. But if you bend it in order to make it kosher, even if it's not naturally kosher, since it's a kosher shofar in the first place, that would be considered having that particular nice thing, which is the nice idea of having a bent shofar. Now, as with many shiurim in the Torah, it has to be at least a tefach long, which is roughly somewhere around 4 inches or so. I don't know of anyone, I've never seen anyone use a shofar that small, but if you did find a shofar, if that's all you had and it was really small, that would still be considered kosher. It doesn't matter what sound the shofar makes. So it could be like a really low, deep sound, or it could be a very high-pitched sound. So it doesn't, whatever sound it makes, that's the sound that it makes. And as we know, when people use those long spiral ones, it makes certain sounds, and if it's bigger, it's a lower pitch, it's small, whatever. Okay. Now we said that it has to be at least a tefach long. So you don't have to use, let's say you have a really long shofar. You don't have to, if it's cut off the base of the animal's skull, you don't have to use the entire length of it. You can cut it shorter if you want. As long as the end result is that it's as long, it's halachically long enough, a tefach long. But let's say you only have 2 small ones and you soften them up and you glue them together, that doesn't work. That's not considered kosher. If you want to lengthen it by adding some plastic or some other metal or material, that also doesn't work. So there's nothing wrong with engraving a shofar. So, a lot of times you might find a shofar, especially when you buy it in like these Judaica shops, they sell souvenirs, and you go to Israel, you buy a shofar and it's engraved, Lishma Kol shofar or something like that. It's a nice engraving. That's totally kosher. However, if it's coated in a metal, right? So then it depends. So if you gild it in gold or silver, as long as it doesn't affect the sound, then it's still considered the sound of the shofar, not the sound of the metal, and it's fine. So if it's just a little bit gilded with a little bit of metal, like a little line here, line there, just to make it look pretty, that would probably be fine. But if there's so much metal coating it that it changes the sound of the shofar, then that would not be kosher, because we're hearing the sound of the silver or gold, and not the sound of the shofar. So that would not be kosher. So, now, if there's a hole in the shofar, let's say somebody knocks a hole in it by mistake, it falls, a little crack or something. So then it depends if the first of all, there has to be a tefach length of shofar without a hole in it, right? We said it has to be 4 inches. So like, let's say the shofar itself is 12 inches long, and the hole is at point as at the 8th inch. So you have 8 inches of kosher shofar without a hole. So then it's kosher, but if the hole makes the sound change, so then what you're really hearing is the sound of the hole, not the sound of the shofar, that also would not be kosher. But if it doesn't really make the sound change, if it's just a small hole, and there's at least a tefach of kosher shofar there, it would be okay. Nowadays, most of the time, the Baal Tokea goes up with probably several, 4, 5, 6, who knows how many shofar. It's highly unlikely that you're ever going to have to worry about these laws, unless you're in a place where there's only one shofar and it's not, and it has all kinds of problems, it's broken or cracked, and these laws might become relevant. You might need to know them. The question is, and what about if it's cracked, right? So then it depends on the general law. There's a lot of debate about what the laws are if it's cracked. And the general idea is if it's mostly cracked, then it's considered not kosher. If it's miyut, if it's a minimally cracked, if it's 12 inches and the crack is only up 2 inches, it still remains kosher, which is important because lots of times at the wide end where the sound comes out of, you'll find a lot of times there's cracks in it. Since it's only a little crack, it doesn't really go deep in. Sometimes people deliberately make cracks in order to make it like a crown or make it look nice. Since it's but those the actual bone of the shofar isn't actually cracked. It's done as a design. But if that crack were to accidentally extend into the shofar, and it only extends a small amount, that's a miyut. So there's various debates and opinions about that. So if it's a full length crack through the whole shofar, then everyone would agree it's not kosher. So those are the basic laws of the shofar itself. So before I move on to the next lecture, which is about the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, any questions or comments about the laws of the shofar itself? Go ahead. Yes.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Does the animal that the shofar comes from have to be a kosher animal? Or
Yes.
not?
Yes, it does have to be a kosher animal. Thanks for bringing that up. I don't think there's any species. I don't know if it's relevant. Like I'm trying to think like what species has horns that's not kosher. I don't know, maybe like a rhinoceros, maybe. I guess if you made it or an elephant. Well, but those would not be, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would think firstly, I mean the two types of horns that you mentioned, one which were more bony and the other, it's interesting. So one is, as you mentioned, is more of made out of bone, and the other is made out of keratin.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Right. Which midrashically has all kinds of fabulous implications, but which all of a sudden, as you were saying it, the fireworks were going off. But going back to so the question about the elephant, I would think the tusk is a bone, right, as opposed to being made out of keratin.
Yeah, I agree. So even if an element were kosher, which it's not, then I would agree that it's probably a bone. I think a rhinoceros, which is also obviously not kosher, but I think that there's this keratin, but it's different somehow. It's like hair, something that's bumbled.
I think it's made out of mangled hair as opposed to keratin proper. In answer a question to does the animal have to be kosher? Does it have to be shechted kosherly in order for the horn to be extracted?
It doesn't.
Okay.
It doesn't. It doesn't have to be shechted. In fact, if you remove the horn and the animal's still alive, it will still be a kosher shofar. But I'm not sure if that's ever done or not. It doesn't sound very nice, but I think it would be a kosher shofar. Any other questions, comments? Go ahead. Yes.
So I'm sorry, I forgot my question. It's all right.
It's okay. All right.
I'm sorry, Helene.
That's okay. No problem. If
no
you remember
worries.
later, just raise your hand.
So, I see. So
Okay.
if the longer the horn, the horn will determine how the sound is. So if the horn is longer, the sound will be lower, right?
I think so. I mean, there probably are people listening to this class that are better sound engineers than I am, but that's what I would.
Well, it's music,
Right, right. But yeah, so I think the longer it is and
Yeah,
bigger the horn is, the deeper the sound.
and that doesn't matter, does it?
No, absolutely not.
Right.
Whatever sound it makes, as long as it's the natural sound of the horn, it's kosher.
That's
So
kind of
some
nice. It's like everybody has different singing voices, and some sing higher, some sing lower, and
Yeah.
just like a horn.
Yep. And if someone has is trying to, like I said, trying to do the shofar with musically and go notes up and down, as long as everything else is halachically done right, it would be kosher, right?
Thank you.
So you could play games with it but it takes a lot of skill, and you have to make sure that you're fulfilling all of the other requirements that we set. But if you're doing that, then the exact note that the shofar is making is not important.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so the next thing after, so that completes the dinim of Rosh Hashanah. Now, it's hard to, I'm trying to focus on the laws and not on the thought. And obviously, there's so much to be said about the Yomim Noraim when we're talking about the ideas that we're supposed to learn, the ideas that we're supposed to internalize, about our worship of God, about our behavior between people, between us and ourselves, so on. There's so much to talk about. The idea of repentance, the idea of din, and din b'cheshbon, and so on. So, but there are places where I'm going to have to segue a little into that but I'm trying to focus only on that when it's relevant to how the laws were made. So the Aseret Yimei Tshuva are the 10 days that are made up of starting Rosh Hashanah and end on Yom Kippur. So those are the 10 days of Teshuvah. The tradition is in Chazal that the rabbis received the tradition that these Aseret Yimei Tshuva are days that are special, that God is specially close to us, and He gives us an opportunity to return to Him, and He's waiting for us. And it's a special type of chesed, a special type of kindness that during the time of din, during the time when He is judging us, is also the time when He allows us the opportunity to correct our ways. If you think about it, if this were a human court, the time to change your behavior is long before you walked into the court and are standing in front of the judge, right? Once you're standing in front of the judge, it's kind of too late to get up there and say, I'm sorry. I mean, it might help you a little bit in the sentencing process, but it's kind of too late to get up there and say, I didn't mean it, I won't do it next time. It's kind of over. But God is not like that. God is kind to us, even when He's sitting, so to speak, with the book of life and death in front of Him and judging our behavior. At that very time, He's waiting for us to come back to Him and learn from our past mistakes and improve, which is really, there's a lot to be said for that. So because ultimately, because we believe, and our religion believes, that God is ultimately good, right? That we believe that, especially in the Kabbalistic world, the idea that God created the world in order to do good to people, right? That was what He wants, to the extent that God could want anything. I'm not going to go into philosophical puzzles, but that's what we believe, that God made the world lehetiv lebriot, to do good. So what He wants is that we should return to Him. So because He's sitting, and the pasuk, the verse that's often quoted is Dirshu Hashem b'hi matzo, is search out God b'hi matzo, when He is to be found. It's a verse in Isaiah, where if you look at the context of the verse, it's actually referring to Isaiah is telling the people to return to God. Isaiah is in contrast to another major prophet, Jeremiah. And I'll explain what I mean. Isaiah was a prophet who prophesied during a time when the kingdom of Judah was strong. The kingdom was there. He did not say his prophecies during the times of destruction. Jeremiah said his prophecies during the time when the temple was destroyed, right? With the years leading up to the time the temple was destroyed, and continued to prophesy during the destruction and after. Isaiah was saying, Dirshu Hashem b'hi matzo, Now is the time to repent before the bad stuff is going to happen later on, right? Now, when we have a king, now when we have the opportunity to do good, now when the Beit HaMikdash is standing, now is the time to seek God. Don't wait until you're desperate and everything's going bad. Everyone can pray when they have nothing to eat, when things are going bad. We all, there's no atheist in the foxhole, right? When the enemy bullets are flying overhead, we all pray. And Dirshu Hashem B'himatzo, when you look at the context, it's a pasuk that's often used, is saying that no, now is the time. The time to turn to God is not when the bullets are flying overhead. It's too late. Bullets are already flying. The times are before the war starts. That's when you're supposed to do it. But another meaning of the verse, which is the meaning that's usually applied to the Sarah Yimei Tshuva, is B'himatzo, when God is there, waiting and ready to listen to us. And I think those two ideas are really very closely related, actually. Because the time that God is most interested in listening to us is not when the bullets are flying overhead and in the foxhole, right? The time when he's most listening to us is when we're happy. I just got a new job. I have money in my bank account. I could afford to go on a vacation. I'm healthy. My kids are healthy. I have peace in my home. That's God wants us to worship him out of that context, right? To worship him when everything's going bad, everybody does that. We'll turn to anywhere. Well, you tell me I do this, I'll do that to try. So Dirshu Hashem B'himatzo is very important. And this is the idea of the Aseret Yimei Tshuva. And I'm mentioning this because there's many, many, many customs that people do in order to, during those 10 days, improve their behavior, look at, the things that we can improve in our own lives. Some people concentrate on special, some people look at more of the halachic aspects of what they do, getting up on time to go to daven in the morning, putting on tefillin every day, eating kosher properly if they weren't doing so beforehand. And also, of course, looking to how we treat our friends, how we treat other people, give more charity, and so on. These are things that we emphasizing during these 10 days. Not to mean, of course, that we don't emphasize them every day of the year, but during these days, our special days, these are the days of B'himatzo, and God wants us to see, he wants to see us behave this way so that he can, because he wants us to be successful in that. So now, so that's the philosophical idea. And like I said, we can talk about this, and every rabbi will talk about this a lot. All kinds of ideas that are related to these days. But now I'm just going to focus on halacha, some of the laws that change because we're during these days. So one is we focus on the idea of malchut, right? The idea that God is our king. So we accept upon ourselves, if he is our king, that means we're obligated to listen to the rules that he set out for us, which means the entire Torah, right? So in order to emphasize that idea, and this is the bottom line of what these days are about, is accepting God's malchut, and therefore we change certain words in davening. Most famously is in Hakel Hakadosh, in the third blessing of the Amidah, we end it by saying, instead of Baruch Atah Hashem Hakel Hakadosh, the holy God, we say Hamelech Hakadosh, the holy King, because we want to emphasize the idea. A God could mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Now, we as Jews have a certain idea of what an el is, and I deliberately used the aleph that time, because an el also refers to idols all over. Elilim refers to idols, right? An el, people make all kinds of things into gods. Gods could be, I don't know, the god of the sea, god of the sky, god of the this, god of the that. An el, and even when we approach the real, true one God as a kel, right? We're looking at a certain, we can be talking about a specific aspect of God as being almighty, all powerful, and these are important into the right context. But on this day, we want to emphasize, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to listen to what he says. An el, right, a God, when you study the prophets, the way an el is worshipped is through sacrifices, right? Through rituals, right? They would bring to their, whatever the God was, each one would have a certain ritual. And even, lahavdil, to separate between the holy and the non-holy, when we worship God, we also have ritual, right? We have rituals that we do in worship of God. But But a melech, a king, the way you listen to a king is not through rituals. The way you listen to a king is by doing what he told you to do, right? By following his commands. So we emphasize the idea of a melech hakadosh, and therefore, if you don't say hamelech hakadosh and you say hakel hakadosh, you have to repeat the whole Shmona Esrei over again because you're missing the main point of davening during this particular time of year. There's other times of year when we can focus on God's greatness, his power, his might, on all other things. But this time of year, we're focusing on his malchus, on his kingship, the fact that he wants us to live a certain way, and the fact that he judges us based on whether or not we follow those instructions. In this very, very similar vein is the blessing of Hamelech HaMishpat. So during the year, we say, Melech, God is a king who is Ohev Tzedakah O Mishpat, who loves righteousness and judgment, which are both extremely important. Tzedakah Mishpat are extremely important ideas, possibly even arguably the most important ideas in the entire Jewish religion. However, this time of year, we are focusing on the Melech HaMishpat, the fact that he's a king and he judges us based on whether or not we do that. Now, there's because when you say Melech Ohev Tzedakah O Mishpat, you do include the ideas of Malchut, of kingship, and you do include the idea of judgment. If you make a mistake and say Melech Ohev Tzedakah O Mishpat instead of Hamelech Mishpat, Ashkenazim and many other poskim say you don't have to repeat the bracha, the blessing, although some Sephardim do actually say you have to repeat the blessing. But l'chatchila, and originally what you're supposed to do is end that blessing with Hamelech Mishpat, again to emphasize that idea. Then there's several additions. Zachrenu l'chaim melech chafetz b'chaim, right? Micha mocha. We also emphasize the melech mishpat, uchsov l'chaim tov, and b'sefer chaim bracha v'shalom. These are all of these additions to Shmona Esrei are additions that the purpose of them is to emphasize the ideas that we just said. And you could look at each one and you'll see what I mean. It's the idea that God is a king, that we have to listen to what he does, and based on whether or not we listen, we get judged. Now, the Avinu Malkeinu is a tefillah that we also add during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. And we add it even if there's no tachlim. So let's say, for example, there's a bris that morning, right, in the shul, or there's a chasan, someone's making a wedding, which, by the way, there was even a time in our history when people specifically made a custom to get married during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. Although some communities don't do nowadays, it's maybe less common, but there's certainly nothing wrong with it if you wanted to schedule a wedding then. So if the chasan is there at shul, you don't say tachlim, but you do say Avinu Malkeinu. But the same idea, Avinu Malkeinu, we're beseeching God both as our Father and as our King. And the idea that we find in the prophets is we approach God. We want him to treat us as a father, but he is our king. And we have to recognize that. And a king could sometimes come down hard on us. So we want to try to make sure that doesn't happen. Whether there's a big debate between Sephardim and Ashkenazim whether or not to say Avinu Malkeinu on Shabbat. And the issue is that within the text of Avinu Malkeinu, there are places where we make specific requests. And there is a custom not to make specific requests of God on Shabbat. Now you'll notice that that in the Shabbat prayers all year round, there's very little. There's a few exceptions that kind of creep in through the back door, where we ask God for something specific. But in the general text of the Shabbos prayers, we don't ask God for anything specific. One of the places where it sneaks in famously is when we say a Misha Berach for people that are cholim, that are sick. And when we say that Misha Berach, we actually apologize to God while we're saying it for doing it on Shabbat. We say Shabbat himi lizo. It's Shabbat now, and we're not supposed to cry out to you specific requests, but we're doing it anyway. So it kind of creeped in. Why it creeped in, we're not learning Hilchos Shabbos right now, but it did creep in, but it's not supposed to be there. So the custom of Ashkenazim is not to say Avinu Malkeinu on Shabbos because of that reason, and therefore, but Sephardim do. They do say it on Shabbos. For similar reasons that we say a Misha Berach, because it's such an important tefillah and it's such an emotional part of davening that they just kind of sneak it into davening anyway. Even though we have objections to it, they want it in there. So Sephardim actually do say it And we don't, or we, I mean Ashkenazi, because I'm an Ashkenazi. If there's Sephardic listeners here, then they have their own customs. So that's the difference in Avinu Malkeinu. Another thing, there's another custom in Shacharit to say Shir Hamalot before Baruch Hu and Shacharit in the regular morning, and on Shabbos morning too. That's actually a Kabbalistic custom. Came from the Arizal, but it became extremely widespread. So both Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities do it, but there may be some shuls that don't. If they don't, it's just because that custom just never made it to that synagogue. I talked about weddings already. There's a big machloket about Kiddush Levana, right? We're supposed to say Kiddush Levana during the first phase of the moon, before it hits the full moon, right? So typically we'll do it, the first Motzei Shabbos, the first Saturday night after Rosh Chodesh, right? That's usually when we do it, and we do it on Motzei Shabbos because everyone's together in shul then, and we're all dressed in our Shabbos finery, and it's a special time, and it's a happy time. But you could do it any day during the week. So some people don't say Kiddush Levana until after Yom Kippur, which only leaves you like 2 or 3 days to do it, right? So so there are some places that's and the reason is because after Yom Kippur, we're really happy because we just achieved forgiveness. So we're happy, and we're assuming that we had a good din. So we're happy. So they want to do Kiddush Levana, which is a happy blessing. So they do it. We do it after Yom Kippur. That's a very widespread custom. There are some people that specifically do it during the Aseret Yimei Tshuva because we want to get as many mitzvot, as many brachos as possible before Yom Kippur starts. So whatever your custom is, it's all good. Now, the custom that I personally was accustomed to, I remember growing up with, is saying Kiddush Levana after Yom Kippur, and then almost every year we end up with only 2 days, and if it's cloudy on Yom Kippur for 2 days after, then you're messed up. So whatever. Anyway, but those are the different things. So I'm going to talk about very briefly. I happen to have, and you're going to find out what my personal opinions are very quickly about the minhag of kapparot. But if someone's insulted by my opinions, then I apologize in advance. But I'm personally will say right now that I'm an anti-kapparot person, and I have good people to depend on, and that is the Rashba and the Shulchan Aruch themselves say that the entire idea, if you think when the kapparot is this custom to the origin is to take a chicken, right, and wave it over your head. And one of the things we say is Zeh Chalifasi, this is in my exchange. Zeh Kapparasi, this animal is my kappara, is my the Rashba and the Shulchan Aruch were famously, vehemently against it because they felt this is a pagan custom. They called it Darkei Amory. And the idea and the concept that an animal could somehow take our place and be a atonement for us is not a Jewish idea. And they were vehemently against it. However, nonetheless, it became an extremely widespread custom, especially in Ashkenazi communities, but even in some Sephardic communities. And then when the Arizal and the Kabbalists supported this custom, so there's a lot of explanations and understandings as to why it's not really Darkei Amory. It's not. So this custom became widespread. Nowadays, there's the issue of cruelty to animals when it comes to people swinging chickens around, especially people that have never handled chickens before. And every year that it raises that issue, which I think is a very important issue that we need to be cognizant of, is that if we think we're going to achieve kappara by abusing an animal, then I think we have a serious problem with what kappara is supposed to be about. And what that's not, that I am sure, I am absolutely positive that God isn't going to give me a better year because I abused the chicken. That I'm very clear. But so then some people use money instead. If that's your custom, then fine. There's a lot, the Arizal and the Ramah, who say that this idea, so it doesn't really mean Zeh Chalifasi. It doesn't really mean this money is instead of me, or this chicken is instead of me. What it really means is that you can get all kinds of explanations. The chicken represents me, or you give the chicken to the poor, the money goes to the poor, so that this should redeem me because I'm doing a good deed with this item, this thing. So there's all kinds of ways around the Darkei Amory problem, and they're all well and good. And if this is your custom to do, then fine, do it. But be cognizant that you have to be careful that you don't actually think that the chicken is taking your place in front of God. So these are kind of the halachic and pseudo halachic customs that have been instituted during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, mostly arising from, like I started, arising from the ideas that are so important during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. I want to make sure to mention a few more things before I end, and then I want to open the floor because I'm sure people have stuff to say. So the next, there's the idea of asking forgiveness of others. Very, very, very important idea, and within which there's a lot of concepts there. We're presenting ourselves in front of God, right? Asking for forgiveness. So when we ask others for forgiveness, the other people have to, we have to be forgiving people. We have to give our friends forgiveness. If we're forgiving people to others, then God will be more forgiving to us. There's a concept out there that Jews don't believe in forgiveness, only Christians do, but that concept is total baloney. Now, there are definitely differences between the Jewish concepts of forgiveness and Christian concepts of forgiveness, which could be a subject for another lecture. And I'm not an expert Christian, but Jews definitely believe in forgiveness, and we're supposed to forgive. However, we're not required to forgive unless a person shows genuine remorse and really if the forgiveness is only going to give the person an excuse to continue being bad to you, then there's no reason to forgive them if all it means is they're going to abuse you again. I'm going to. There's a lot of laws general about, and I just barely touched the iceberg of who you're supposed to ask. How do you ask mechila, forgiveness from others? What if they're not alive anymore? How do you ask forgiveness? How do you ask forgiveness if you did something that can't be withdrawn? You made a rumor about someone, and now the whole world is walking around saying things about this person that may not be true or may not be fully true, and no matter how many times you get up and announce that it's the asking forgiveness, the rumor's out there, damage is done. So there's a lot of laws about mechila, which I'm not going to go into. Just to mention the idea, another thing I think is important is when we go to a friend and ask for forgiveness, it's easy to stand in front of God in a sense and ask for forgiveness for something because God is a concept. We don't really see him. He's not there. But when you actually go to a person, a friend of yours, a family member, someone that you know, and you actually have to ask and really mean it, forgiveness, then it's humbling. It's really humbling. And it's important for us to be humble. And when we present ourselves in front of God, we need to be humble as well. And then I just want to mention the Shabbos Shuvah. There's not a lot of laws, but the custom of the rabbi giving the speech, a Shabbos Shuvah drasha, is an ancient custom that goes back a long way. The idea of the Shabbos Shuvah drasha is to arouse the tzibur, arouse people to the ideas and concepts which we just discussed. It's called Shabbos Shuvah because the Haftorah comes from the Navi Hosea and starts Shuvah Yisrael Hashem Elokecha, beseeching the Jews to return to God. So that's why it's called Shabbos Shuvah. I'll stop here. Next time we'll talk about the mitzvos of Erev Yom Kippur, the day before Yom Kippur, and then we'll head into Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur itself, there's a lot of laws, and I hope we can finish them before Yom Kippur. But we'll try. There's a lot to talk about on Yom Kippur. And I apologize, I did not discuss the laws of Tzom Gedalia, the fast of Gedalia. One day we'll get to learning the fasts, the 4 fasts that were decreed over the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Tzom Gedalia is one of those 4, and we'll have to discuss that in a different context. But I apologize, I skipped that. But it also lands in the middle of the 10 days of Tshuva. Any comments, questions, things you want to share? Fire away. The floor is open.
Class next week.
I'm trying to remember. Is it the Maharat's turn next week, or is it mine?
Yeah, but it's Rosh Hashanah next.
Motzei Rosh Hashanah. That's why I'm asking.
Oh, it's Motzei Rosh Hashanah. No, so there's no right. So next week, forget it. And then let me think. So
Yom Kippur is Thursday night.
Kippur is
Wednesday
is-
night, sorry.
is Wednesday night. So that means we're not having class the next 2 weeks. Oh, so then I won't have a chance to talk about Hilchos Yom Kippur before Yom Kippur.
What about Simchas Torah? The Wednesday is, the third Wednesday is Simchas Torah.
I'm gonna have to figure this out. Maybe we can do another night, because that means we'll never touch on the laws of Yom Kippur. I mean, I kind of knew that there was gonna